Hey there. So there's a video I've been trying to make for a while, and which is essentially a response to a viewer who messaged me suggesting that they'd be interested in knowing in a more detailed, practical sense how I would go about putting together a particular sort of spell. And I thought it would be a lot of fun to do that. So I wrote the spell and sorted out exactly how I would go about doing this in conjunction with another person, as though I were consulting for somebody else who was the actual subject of the spell and who would be doing it themselves. But when it came time to actually put together the video, I ran into an issue, and that issue is what has inspired this video. And that issue was that I was torn regarding how to present the spell itself, how to walk viewers through my thought process. More specifically, whether to first present the spell with the wooey, witchy rationales for the things I included, and then only afterwards present the psychological and neurological reasons behind many of those same choices. Or, alternately, I could present both the woo and the scientific rationale simultaneously while I went through it, explaining how I braid together those two approaches basically at every step along the way, because that is how I approach my practice. However, I found that I was really disinclined to take that second option. Definitely the way to present this would be first the spell with the woo and the correspondences and the ritual structure with the symbolism and the lore and the etc., etc. And then later I would explain all of the psychological reasons that I also incorporated this thing and that thing and that thing and that thing. And it immediately struck me that the reason I much preferred to present it that way was that although I am always very much aware of the psychological components, the psychological trickery that I include in my craft, I am, after all, the one designing my practice, the one executing it, which means I am aware of all the nuts and bolts that I am consciously including. The reality is that I suspect there is a decent number of people for whom spellcraft becomes less effective when they are made consciously aware of some of the psychological effects that they intuitively include, unconsciously include, or in the case of this particular sort of spell, that other people composing, putting together a spell on their behalf would include, possibly. Well, certainly I would. And so today I wanted to talk about some of the reasons for why I think that may be. Now, first off, I have noticed an interesting, I think, tendency among certain groups of witches, although by no means all, but there's definitely a population of witches, pagans, spiritual or magical practitioners for whom the inclusion of aspects of a spell or practices that are, from their perspective, informed explicitly by science is somehow less sacred or takes the shine off their practice, sucks the woo out of what they're doing, and may in fact be counterproductive, as though there is some fundamental opposition between scientific information, that is, information garnered via the scientific method, and any sort of spiritual field, practice, what have you. Now, I find this sort of perspective interesting because I get it on the surface. I mean, there's some aspect of it that sort of sounds like it could be true, but it's simultaneously an idea that, for me anyways, falls apart the second you nudge it just a little bit, think about it a little bit. The reasons I feel that way include the fact that whether you're observing or consciously aware of these phenomena or not, they're there, they're acting. The psychological aspects of all of our practices exist. Whether you believe your practice is influenced, informed, shaped, or in large part executed by some other external source, some other rule set or power. I don't think anybody actually believes that psychology, their own mind, their own personalities have no bearing on the process. Nor do I think that many people in this era really believe that they are absolutely objective, rational beings that are not subject to quirks of the cognitive process or biases or social and environmental influence. In fact, for many people, that very idea would be anathema to their practice, given that so many of our practices, although again, obviously not all, but many of them reserve a large chunk of thought and consideration to the ways in which we are connected with the world around us, with others, the different layers of our persona and being. And yet, despite this, there are definitely some people who, when made consciously aware, or when invited rather to consciously consider something they already know, that they are influenced by psychology and neurology and biology, physiology, genetics, and that they are influenced by those things, even in circle, even at their most spiritual. It seems to feel to them as though this is some other field, some foreign entity encroaching on their sacred space. The other issue is the fallacy that the line we draw between that which is scientific and that which isn't scientific is drawn between subjects that are scientific and non-scientific, rather than the way we approach those subjects. There really isn't any such thing as a topic or concept that can only be considered from a scientific viewpoint. Nor is there really any subject or topic that cannot be explored from a scientific viewpoint. I know people like to talk about, well, that's outside the realm of science, but that has frankly always annoyed me because, no, it's not. Not theoretically. There's no reason why that would be the case. When people say that it's outside the realm of science, what they're saying is that we do not have the methodological capability to explore this from a scientific standpoint, which is not the same thing as it's theoretically impossible to explore from a scientific standpoint, nor is it the same thing as saying we will never be in a position to explore it from a scientific standpoint. The line between science and woo is a methodological one. It's an approach. When I say that I'm using a scientific approach to spellcraft, I mean that decisions regarding the practice I'm preparing to engage in are being made based on hypotheses and theories that have emerged from experimentation, from evidence garnered using a scientific method, observation, measurement, replication, controls. It has thus far never meant that I feel forced to include or omit any particular field of exploration from my spiritual practice. Now again, among a certain subset of people that I've met, this is an idea that they fully embrace when, for instance, we talk about things like medicinal teas. A lot of witches are into herbs and folk medicines, and a decent chunk of those now have been studied by scientists. You can find studies published following peer review, exploring the effects of all sorts of herbs and oils and extracts and teas. And yet I feel like these same people get sort of uncomfortable with the idea of these same concepts applied to the psychological realm, as though they feel more confident that herbs, plants, and folk medicine is their turf, and that psychology is not. To a certain extent, part of this may be due to the historical legitimacy fallacy, right? The idea that herbs and plants are part of that mental image of the wise woman from lore. We feel like she's one of our people, she's been around for hundreds of years, this is her turf, we feel comfortable claiming it because of this historical precedent. Whereas psychology, in the formalized sense, and particularly biological psychology or neuro, is a relatively new field. But even though psychology, the concept of how the mind works is something that has been explored for a very, very long time. Many of those conceptualizations, these old ideas about how psychology works, haven't really survived robustly in the modern era. They're not really ones that we popularly give much consideration to or ascribe any particular significance to. I mean, when I think about pop psychology, the stuff that most people are familiar with and engage with, you're hard-pressed to find anyone calling on any psychological theories that predate Freud. Not explicitly, anyway. I think another aspect of this discomfort that we sometimes run into with engaging explicitly in the use of psychology and neural function-related physiology or biology, and the general unease associated with really considering their impact on our spellcraft or our rituals or our practice, can be that it sort of undermines this notion of mental autonomy and self-control. And many of us in turn equate objectivity with realness, in a sense, to suggest that the incredibly vivid vision we experienced of a spirit guide may have been internally generated rather than a sensory manifestation of one's interaction with an actual external being strips the legitimacy away from that experience. Now, I don't think that's the case. And I certainly don't think that my or anyone else's feelings about the probability of that experience being internally generated proves that there was no external spirit or consciousness with which one was communicating. But I do think that the mere suggestion of that possibility is sometimes interpreted as a threat, something more than criticism, and certainly something more than idle pondering. And I think that threat is the idea that our practice and the significance of what we do can be undermined by this question of mechanism, how it works, why it influences us. Now, on the psychological end, I also think there are some good arguments to be made for withholding the psychological rationale for some of the things one includes in a spell or ritual on somebody else's behalf, particularly somebody who does not personally engage consciously with the use of psychology in their practice. The first is that placebo effects are handy, potent. If you've watched any of my videos, you probably know I'm a pretty big fan. And they are stronger when one is not aware that they're being used. Therefore, the use of any placebos in a spell or ritual are enhanced when one is not aware that one is engaging with the use of placebos. The next issue is that the suggestion that psychological methods are being used, particularly the suggestion that they're being used to people who are generally uncomfortable with the idea of mixing psych and spellcraft, or unfamiliar and uncomfortable about the whole field of psychology. Well, in that case, those people may therefore be at greater risk for experiencing something like a nocebo effect, which is sort of like not actually the opposite of a placebo, but is the experience of negative repercussions, negative symptoms or experiences, or reduced efficacy as a result of a placebo or drug, or essentially any intervention, where the placebo effect is positive response to something that has no known biological means of directly eliciting such a response. A nocebo effect is a negative response, which again cannot be directly attributed to any clear mechanistic action of whatever you're doing or whatever is going on. Finally, although I consciously incorporate evidence-based items or processes in my spellcraft and rituals, when I am actually engaged in the act of spellcraft and ritual, I am most certainly not thinking about psychology or neuro. I am focused entirely on the spiritual act, on the ritual, as an expression of my path, my journey, and as an act of woo. And so for the sheer purpose of encouraging that the focus of somebody I was consulting for remained on the spiritual act, on the magical, wooey process, which I think in its own right is very potent. I think it is, in fact, preferable not to share the extraneous and frankly irrelevant psychological bits. Not if that person's sole interest is in having that act of spellcraft work. Obviously, all the details and information is helpful and useful if one is actually trying to get a sense of how other people construct spells and rituals. Well, I think that brings us full circle. I would be very interested to hear from you guys in the YouTube pagan community whether you consider there to be a line between what aspects of biology or psychology can be admitted into your practice without negatively impacting you. Whether you consciously engage in psychological self-manipulation or simply get there through the intuitive use of approaches that have that effect, no doubt, but aren't there in the ritual because they do that, but for some other spiritually relevant reason. To all of you who managed to stick with me all the way through this rather meandering little mental stroll, I'd like to thank you for watching and wish you a wonderful night.